Imagine, for a moment, that you've been struggling to make ends meet. You're living paycheck to paycheck, and the last of your money is gone. You're scraping by, but then, in a moment of unexpected crisis, you are faced with a decision. Do you keep the little you have left for yourself, or do you give it to someone else? Someone who's facing their own personal crisis. In the story I'm about to share with you, we'll meet Mrs. Karen, a teacher who gave away her last $5, something that seemed so small at the time, but turned out to be life-changing for not only her student, but an entire community. This is a story of kindness, empathy, and the incredible power of one selfless act. But before we dive into this incredible tale of compassion, I want you to take a moment to hit that subscribe button. We're working towards 1,000 subscribers, and with your help, we can continue sharing these life-affirming stories with the world. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. Mrs. Karen was an ordinary teacher, and yet her story is anything but ordinary. She wasn't someone who lived in luxury or had an abundance of material wealth. She was a dedicated educator, driven by a passion for shaping young minds, for giving children the knowledge and tools they would need to succeed in life. But despite her passion for teaching, she struggled. Her salary barely covered the bills, and at times, she found herself putting her own needs aside to ensure her students had what they needed. Teachers like Mrs. Karen often go unnoticed, but their work is immeasurable. They shape the future, one lesson at a time. And while Mrs. Karen may not have had a lot to give, she always gave what she could. Whether it was using her own money to buy supplies, staying after hours to help struggling students, or simply offering a kind word to a student who needed it, Mrs. Karen embodied the essence of selflessness. But despite her devotion to her students, her own life wasn't easy. She had her own set of challenges to overcome, her own battles to fight. In addition to her work, she also dealt with the stress of managing finances, worrying about bills, and living paycheck to paycheck. Yet, through it all, she never let her personal struggles interfere with her role as an educator. She was there for her students, day in and day out, giving her all. And then one afternoon, everything changed. The moment of decision. Mrs. Karen's last $5. It was a rainy Friday afternoon, a day that seemed like any other. The students were packing their bags and preparing to leave for the weekend, the usual excitement of the approaching break filling the air. But there was something different about this particular day. As the students filed out, one young girl, Emily, stayed behind, looking hesitant, almost as if she was waiting for something or someone. Emily was a student who often kept to herself. She didn't draw attention, always wearing the same worn clothes and trying to fit in as best as she could. Her face often showed signs of worry, and Mrs. Karen had noticed that Emily wasn't quite as happy as the other children. She seemed distant, her mind often somewhere else. Mrs. Karen had always been a compassionate teacher, always aware of her students' emotional well-being, and she could tell that Emily was struggling. On this particular afternoon, Emily approached Mrs. Karen's desk with a slight tremor in her voice. "Mrs. Karen, I don't have enough money to buy lunch today," she said, barely above a whisper. It was a simple statement, but it hit Mrs. Karen like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about missing lunch. Mrs. Karen knew Emily's family had been going through hard times. Emily's mother had lost her job, and her father worked long hours at a minimum wage job that barely covered the rent. The stress, the uncertainty, the fear of not knowing when things would get better, it all weighed heavily on Emily, and Mrs. Karen could see it. Emily, like many of her classmates, came from a family that struggled to make ends meet. But the difference between Emily and some of the others was that she didn't complain. She didn't ask for help. She kept her struggles hidden, hoping no one would notice. But Mrs. Karen noticed. In that moment, Mrs. Karen realized that this wasn't just about food. This was about more than just a lunch. This was about the fact that this young girl, who should have been focusing on her education and dreams, was being burdened by circumstances that were beyond her control. And that's when Mrs. Karen made a decision. She reached into her purse, knowing she only had $5 left, the last of her money until payday. But she didn't hesitate. She handed the $5 to Emily and said, "Take it. You deserve it. You shouldn't have to worry about this today." Emily's eyes widened, her face full of surprise and gratitude. She tried to refuse, but Mrs. Karen insisted, pressing the crumpled bill into her hand. "No, Emily, take it. It'll help. You matter. You are important." It wasn't just $5. It was a message that said, "You are seen, you are loved, you are worth it." What Mrs. Karen didn't know at that moment was that her simple act of kindness would create a ripple effect far beyond what she could have imagined. That $5 given in an instant of empathy and compassion would not only change Emily's life, it would change the entire school. Emily walked out of Mrs. Karen's classroom that day with more than just lunch money. She walked out with a renewed sense of hope, with the knowledge that someone cared about her, that someone believed in her. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt that she mattered. She wasn't just another student in a crowded classroom. She was an individual, someone worthy of attention and love. But the impact didn't stop with Emily. As the days went by, her attitude began to change. She started to come to school with a smile, participating more in class, and even helping her classmates. Her grades improved, but more importantly, her confidence grew. She began to believe in herself, and that belief became the foundation for everything else in her life. And it didn't stop there. Emily's transformation inspired other students in the class. They began to open up about their own struggles, and the atmosphere in the classroom began to shift. The students started looking out for one another. They helped each other with homework, shared lunch when someone was short on money, and offered words of encouragement. They formed bonds that transcended their individual hardships. The ripple effect spread through the school, and soon the entire community became involved. Teachers, parents, and local businesses all stepped in to support families in need. They organized food drives, clothing donations, and after-school programs to help students who were struggling. It wasn't just about a single $5 bill. It was about creating a culture of care, of looking out for one another, and of coming together to lift each other up. What started as a small act of kindness snowballed into a movement of empathy, and it all began with Mrs. Karen's decision to give her last $5 to a student in need. This story is a powerful reminder of the importance of empathy. We live in a world where it's easy to become disconnected, to focus on our own struggles and forget that others are fighting battles we can't see. But the truth is, empathy is a muscle we can all strengthen. It's something that transcends wealth, status, and material possessions, and the impact of a single act of empathy can be far-reaching. Mrs. Karen's story also teaches us that sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest impact. She didn't have much, but what she gave was priceless. The lesson here is that we don't need to wait until we have everything figured out. We don't need to wait until we're rich, successful, or comfortable to help others. The most powerful acts of kindness often come from those who have the least. Because those who have been through hardships themselves understand the importance of giving. They understand the power of simply showing up for someone else. As you listen to this story, I want you to ask yourself, how can I make a difference? What small act of kindness can I offer today? You don't need to be a teacher or have money to give. Sometimes it's just about being present, about listening, about offering a kind word or a helping hand. What Mrs. Karen did wasn't extraordinary in terms of the action itself. It wasn't a grand, heroic gesture. It was just a teacher doing what she knew was right. But the impact was extraordinary. It shows us that every one of us has the power to make a difference, no matter where we are, no matter how much we have. And that's the beauty of kindness. It doesn't need to be big to be powerful. As we wrap up, I challenge you to think about the impact you can have on those around you. How can you be a light in someone's life today? You don't have to have $5 or even money to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is a little bit of heart, a little bit of compassion, and a willingness to help someone in need. And before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Let's reach 1,000 subscribers so we can continue sharing stories like Mrs. Karen's, stories that remind us that we all have the power to change the world, one small act of kindness at a time. Thank you for listening, and remember, you matter, your actions matter, and together we can make the world a better place.